So why be larger? So there's a number of benefits that one can list that are associated with larger body sizes. For example, an organism that's larger can be resistant to engulfment by, for example, phagotrophic protists. So if you are a cell and you can be engulfed by another cell, if you can be a larger cell, the ability of that other cell to engulf you may be reduced. And in fact, if you banded together as multiple cells, the potential for the phagocytic cell to engulf you also would be reduced. So resistance to engulfment is one important means by which a larger size might have evolved. Of course, it couldn't have evolved in response to this kind of selective pressure before there was, in fact, engulfment. So phagocytosis would have had to have evolved prior to the evolution of larger size by this means. There is, in turn, an ability to, in fact, engulf or, in fact, ingest if you're a multicellular organism. In order to take other organisms into your body, or even just chunks of food into your body or the cell that makes up yourself, you have to be, to some degree, larger than the thing that is being engulfed or ingested. So in order to take up that niche of engulfment or ingestion, the organisms involved have to be relatively large. You also can have greater sophistication when you're larger. You can have different parts of you that do different things. The eukaryotic cell is a wonderful example of this, where you have multiple organelles spread throughout the cell that do different tasks. But as you get larger and become multicellular, you can then have multiple different tissues, the products of cellular differentiation, that are able to perform different tasks within the same body. Now, this is possible also when you have multiple different species that have banded together, such as into a microbial consortium. But that is a situation that's less stable than having it all occur within a single organism. And this is because the reproductive fates of the cells that band together into a microbial consortium are not necessarily as tightly tied together as they are when you have an organism that is able to, for example, display cellular differentiation. So its own cells with the same genotype can display different phenotypes, have different functions. Now, of course, within our own bodies, we still have these consortia type interactions because we have normal flora, and our normal flora play important roles in the functioning of our bodies. So we continue to take advantage of the idea of having multiple different species banded together in order to have a greater level of functionality within a single organism. I guess putting quotes around organism in this case. But nevertheless, that is combined with actually having different functions associated with an individual organism, or even different functions associated with different parts of cells, as you see with the different organelles in eukaryotic cells. So cellular differentiation, of course, we've just been talking about, is a benefit that can come with being larger, particularly being larger and multicelled. And the most important task of cellular differentiation can be the separation of the germline from the somatic cells, where the somatic cells play a role of protecting the germline, assuring the potential for the germline to reproduce, while at the same time the germline doesn't have to contribute to other functions besides just replicating. There are other advantages to having a sequestered germline, therefore having this basic differentiation between soma and germline, and we'll get to what those advantages are. There could be greater competitiveness that comes with being larger. And we looked at this in terms of biofilms when we talked about the shading of biofilms by a larger biofilm. In that case, it's the shading of nutrients or oxygen from the surrounding medium. But of course, there's also shading that's associated with trees and plants and things that require access to resources that are found overhead. There also probably is shading in terms of sponges sponges and other filter feeders where you have, or suspension feeders, where you have the individuals that are upstream being able to grab more of what's suspended in the water than those individuals that are found immediately downstream. It's another kind of shading. There's also the potential to have access to physically separated resources. A great example of that, again, is plants, where plants have access to water and minerals from their roots, but their roots are in a different location, quite literally, from their leaves, which have access to the sun and therefore the energy that the plants gather. And only by being larger can the same organism inhabit both of these locations simultaneously. In that case, both the soil and the environment that's above the soil. There also can be more progeny produced per reproductive episode if you're larger. If you're a single cell, you're not going to be able to make too many more progeny cells per reproductive episode than just one or perhaps two in the case of, for example, budding. However, or I guess you can have maybe 4 in the case of a meiotic type division. However, when you are multi-celled, you can devote multiple cells to the reproductive process and therefore produce multiple progeny per reproductive episode. So these individuals that are larger can be multi-celled, can display sophistication as a consequence of cellular differentiation, and part of that cellular differentiation can be some cells that are replicating, while replicating in the sense of reproducing, contributing to the next generation of organisms, while at the same time other cells play roles such as of gathering of energy and nutrients. And therefore, you can potentially devote many, many cells to the production of progeny, much more so than if you were just a single-celled organism, or even a multi-celled organism that's smaller. When you're looking at the evolution of plants, you can see that there is an increase in the ability of the plants to produce spores, the more primitive non-seed-bearing plants, as you go, for example, from the relatively small mosses to the relatively large ferns. Larger organisms also have some potential to display heteroparity that can be not available to smaller organisms. And heteroparity is multiple reproductive episodes per lifespan. So for example, a tree may flower and fruit every year. That would be an example of heteroparity. Another example is ourselves, where we have multiple reproductive episodes. So we have babies at different times over the course of our lifespan. And this is instead of simply having all of your resources put towards one reproductive act. If you're sufficiently small, you're not going to have the reserves available in order to make sure that you can reproduce after you've gone through a reproductive act. Instead, you display semiparity, which is the production of one essentially clutch of progeny organisms per lifespan. And this is what you see with bacteria. Bacteria grow, 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 go through binary fission. Then grow, 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 go through binary fission. Now that's not a terrible way of reproducing, but it's not quite the same in terms of number of individuals that are produced per reproductive episode as, say, an oak tree, which can make thousands and thousands of acorns per reproductive episode, and then, in fact, have another reproductive episode potentially of the same magnitude the following year. Now, there are benefits to being larger, but there are also costs associated with being larger. As a consequence, the world is still full of many, many, many very small organisms. So being larger is not a cure-all for all the world's problems. But it does supply organisms with both advantages and an ability to exploit new niches. But with these advantages and with this expanded ecological sophistication, you also have problems. So one of these problems is that population sizes of larger organisms tend to be smaller than population sizes of smaller organisms. If you're larger, there simply isn't enough room for the same population size as there can be when you're smaller. So bacteria can have huge population sizes, whereas larger organisms, in fact, such as everything but ourselves, really, tend to have much smaller population sizes. than microorganisms can have. There's also greater maintenance and growth costs associated with being larger. If nothing else, if you're putting off the point where you're reproducing far into the future in order to grow much larger before you reproduce, there is a time cost associated with being larger. But also there is a cost associated with gathering much larger amounts of energy and also avoiding predation for longer periods of time when you're larger, because it takes longer and it requires more energy to make larger bodies. There are also surface to volume ratio issues that have to be solved if you're larger. If you're smaller, the ratio of your energy and nutrient absorbing area relative to the size of your cytoplasm, the volume of your cytoplasm, is quite large. And therefore it's easy for that plasma membrane to feed the cytoplasm that's contained within. This is a basic aspect of the niche that bacteria inhabit. But as you get larger, the size of your cytoplasm grows to the third power, whereas the size of your plasma membrane grows to the second power. The amount of cytoplasm that must be fed by a given amount of plasma membrane keeps going up and up and up. This is a surface to volume problem. There are also surface to volume problems even in multi-celled organisms, where you have to have, for example, circulatory systems in large animals as well as plants in order to move materials around the body. So this is a problem with being larger, and it's solved in various ways, but it has to be solved in order for an individual to grow larger. You also tend to see more sophisticated reproductive strategies with larger organisms. For example, humans. Look what we do in order to reproduce. That's so much different and greater than what a bacterium has to do in order to reproduce. Now, we like to think of our reproductive strategies as pretty awesome, but another way of looking at them is that they're pretty costly and they take a long time, and they also can be rather dangerous. In many ways, being a bacterium and just going through binary fission is better than for the organism in terms of time and energy costs than it is for an organism to go through elaborate sexual processes in order to reproduce. And so what you have is these elaborate processes that can be viewed as solving problems that are associated with being larger, not so much as necessarily being improvements on the reproductive strategies associated with smaller organisms. Although there are some improvements too, particularly when reproduction is tied to dissemination and a larger organism can more effectively disseminate its progeny. There's the problem of movement of materials around bodies. Once you're no longer just a single cell, you no longer can take advantage of just movement that can occur within cells, such as cytoplasmic streaming that you see in plant cells. And instead, you have to invent new ways that you can move materials from one point in a multicelled organism to another point. There's also the problem of greater susceptibility to shear forces. If you've ever noticed that really large banners or large flags have holes cut in them, why is that? Because if they didn't, the wind would just cut them to shreds, would rip them to shreds, and that's shear forces at work. When things get very, very large, the shear forces become greater, and as a consequence, the strength of the organism that basically resists these shear forces has to become greater as well. So if you have a larger body, even if it's a larger body within an aquatic environment, you still have to deal with the fact that different parts of your body can be twisted and pulled in different directions, and the body needs to be able to resist those forces. There also can be a need for a more sophisticated immune system. When you're larger, you're that much more tempting a hunk of meat or a hunk of plant for a potential cheater to attack and destroy and utilize the resources that you've gone through the trouble of actually gathering. So you need to have means by which you can prevent these attacks from either happening or from continuing. And in order to do that, you need to have more sophisticated immune systems than you can see, for example, in bacteria. Bacteria actually have relatively sophisticated immune systems, but of course things like vertebrate animals have that much more sophisticated immune systems than, for example, a bacterium does. And we need to have these because we're more vulnerable, because it only takes one parasite getting inside of us and then replicating like crazy to bring our whole body down unless we can fight off that parasite. And similarly, there's need for more sophisticated blocks on cheating. So a parasite can be considered to be a cheater from without, but there's also cheating from within, where you have the potential for mutationally derived cheaters. In order for very large numbers of cells to band together as a cooperative unit, and to do so over long periods of time, you need relatively sophisticated means by which you can prevent cheating from arising within those systems. And just like parasites from without, or cheaters from without, keeping these cheaters that have arisen from within from taking down the whole system, such as, for example, a cancer can. And in fact, cancers represent examples of mutationally derived cheaters from within that have not been brought under control, and as a consequence are able to destroy the cooperative unity and functionality of a multicellular organism. So these are problems that come from being larger and more sophisticated. So in order to take advantage of the upsides to being larger and more sophisticated, an organism needs to also deal with the downsides associated with being larger and more sophisticated.